Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Urvashi Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Journalism and Mass Communication from Jagannath University, Jaipur. In today's session, we'll try to know more about the official press legislations from the year 1799 to 1878. In order to prevent the growth and development of press in India, the British government decided to pass certain acts and regulations. The intention behind these acts was not to spread the specifically nationalist views and sentiments through the newspapers. Now, East India Company wanted to prohibit the Indians from coming together, uniting themselves, and in a way launching a revolt against the government. So, here are some important acts and regulations that were passed during the British rule: Censorship Press Act, Licensing Regulation Ordinance, Press Act or the Metcalfe Act, Licensing Act, Vernacular Press Act, Registration Act, Indian Press Act, and Newspaper Act. Now let's look at the Censorship of Press Act 1799. Lord Wellesley enacted this act, anticipating French invasion of India. It imposed almost wartime press restrictions, which included pre-censorship. Now, what is pre-censorship? Pre-censorship means before anything could be published in the newspaper, it was sent to the British officials to have a look. If they gave green signal for the content to be printed, it was published. These restrictions were relaxed under Lord Hastings, who had a progressive view, and in 1818 pre-censorship was dispensed with. Next is Licensing Regulations 1823. The acting Governor General John Adams, who had reactionary views, enacted these. According to these regulations, starting or using a press without a license was a penal offense, which meant that anybody who wanted to start publishing or who wanted to own a press has to get himself a license. Otherwise, it was considered to be a penal offense. These restrictions were directly, chiefly against Indian language newspapers. It was more towards or more stringent towards the Indian language newspaper or the vernacular press as we know it. And as these were also edited by the Indians, so the Indian press or the people who were publishing the newspapers in Indian languages or who were owning the Indian press came under the periphery of these regulations. Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Miratul Akbar had to stop its publication because of this act. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy Miratul Akbar was in Persian language, so it had to be stopped as it fell under the penal offense according to this regulation. Press Act of 1835 or Metcalfe Act. Metcalfe, Governor General from 1835 to 86, reappealed the obnoxious 1823 ordinance and earned the title of Liberator of the Indian Press. So he let go of pre-censorship on the content of the newspaper which was published. The new Press Act 1835, however, required that printer or the publisher to give a precise account of premises of publication, which means they have to mention from where the newspaper was published, and cease functioning if required by a similar declaration. If they wanted that it should be ceased, their publication should be ceased, they have to follow it. The result of the liberal press policy was that there was a rapid growth of newspaper in India. It led to the growth of vernacular press in India because pre-censorship was done away with. Right now, the only thing was it required that the publisher need to mention, okay, the place or the area from where the publication was done. Licensing Act 1857. Okay, now because 1857 is a milestone year in the Indian history. It was a year when Sepoy Mutiny or 1857 revolt has just taken place, right? Now, the Britishers have seen what it was when the country or the masses united against them. So, in order to curb or in order to not allow people from uniting, this Licensing Act of 1857 was implemented. It was due to the emergency caused by the revolt of 1857 or the Sepoy Mutiny as we call it. This act was imposed, which required licensing restriction in addition to the already existing registration procedure laid down by the Matt-Caffell Act. And the government reserved the right to stop the publication, circulation of any book, newspaper or printed matter. Now, Metcalfe Act made it clear that the publisher or the printer has to declare the place of the publication from where the newspaper or the book was published. Now, after the revolt of 1857, right, because of the Metcalfe Act, there was a revolution in the growth of language press, which meant that the say the information in the Indian language or the local language was reaching people, which meant people understood what the revolutionaries were trying to convince them about the ill effects of the British rule. They were now getting the idea of Swaraj, independence, right? Now, Licensing Act was implemented because the Britishers had seen the unity in Sepoy Mutiny. Now, in order to say let it go, in order to restrict it, they came up with the Licensing Act, which meant the Metcalfe Act remained intact, but it gave the extra say rights to the government to stop the publication of any newspaper, the circulation of books or the printed matter which they thought were derogatory. Now the Registration Act of 1867. This act replaced Metcalfe Act of 1835 and was of a regulatory, not restrictive nature. Now it was also regulating, it was not restricting the publication. As per the Act, every book or the newspaper was required to print the name of the printer, the publisher, and the place of publication. Like Metcalfe Act, which made it clear the place of the publication need to be cleared, this Act added another two basic information that need to be there whenever a book or the newspaper was published. It was the name of the printer, who is the publisher, and from where the newspaper or the book is published. Secondly, a copy was to be submitted to the local government within 1 month of the publication of book. Now, the content was also brought under scrutiny. If you are publishing a book, a copy of it, free of cost, must be submitted to the local government office so that they can have a look at the content, right? So that they could see what was being percolated and disseminated to the masses. Next comes the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which is also known popularly as Gagging Act. Now, this Vernacular Press Act was enacted to curtail the freedom of vernacular newspaper in India in 1878. Why to curtail or to reduce or to say lessen the freedom of vernacular press? Because vernacular press was emerging as a tool. It was like a say wildfire in the forest, which was telling people or the masses about the colonial ill effects of the colonial rule, the atrocities that Britishers were say doing on the Indian people, and how the wealth of India, how the resources of India were manipulated and used by the East India Company or the Crown. So this act was implemented so that such information should not go down to the people. If it goes down to the people, now people were demanding independence, people were of view that they should have freedom, so they would unite and it would say end the rule of crown in the country. So therefore this act was basically focusing on the vernacular press. The English language publications were excluded. It was proposed by Lord Lytton, who was then the Viceroy of India. This was basically to prevent the vernacular newspaper from expressing, criticizing the British policies. Actions were taken against the various vernacular newspapers like the Som Prakash, the Bharat Mihir, and the Deccan Prakash, to name a few. The Newspaper Act of 1908. This act was there to put some restrictions against the 9 newspaper, and it confiscated 7 presses. The Indian Press Act of 1910. The Act of 1910 was a revision of vernacular press of 1872. According to this act, local government was given power to demand a security at registration from the printer or the publisher, and it also had right to deregister if it was an offending newspaper. Let us understand it. Now this was another tool to restrict the growth of vernacular press. Now it was required to send a copy to a local, say, government office of any book that was printed, any, say, material that was printed, so that they could have a look, right? Now, according to this act, it gave more power to local government. Now, these members of the local government or the officials of the local government were demanding security at registration, which meant if I, as a publisher or the printer, wanted to come out with a newspaper, I have to give a security amount, deposit a security amount at the local government. That is not it. The local government, if it found that the content was derogatory, if it found that the content was offending or the content was against the crown, they can deregister my newspaper and I have to cease publishing. Hence, the printer of the newspaper was required to submit 2 copies of each issue to the local government, which meant every day the copies were submitted at the local government, they were looked upon, and if anything was derogatory, the press was asked, was deregistered, the security amount was taken by the government officials, it added to their resources, it added to their, say, account. Deregistration, you could not publish the newspaper, which meant there was a scrutiny on the content that was being published by these publishers. Now, Indian Press Emergency Powers Act of 1931. When the civil disobedience movement under the leadership of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had started against the British colonial government, the Indian Press Emergency Act was enacted in 1831. Now, what does this act do? This act empowered the provincial government to suppress the propaganda of newspaper for civil disobedience movement. However, in 1932, this act was amplified in the form of Criminal Amendment Act of 1932. Now, during this time, the masses were united, they were eager, they were together working towards a cause. The cause was to get independence or freedom from the British rule. And the prominent leader in this whole scenario emerged out to be Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Now, through his values of non-violence and peace, he was able to unite people to come together for a common cause, that was independence. Now he started with the civil disobedience movement, which was not following the orders of the government. Right? The masses were asked not to turn violent, but not to obey the say the rules or the policies which the British government was implementing, right? And the act gave provincial governments the power to suppress newspaper. Again, these newspapers were vernacular in nature, not to promote what was happening in one part of the country so that the other part is unaware of it and similar situation does not arise in this part. So in order to create a communication gap, in order to create say lack of information as what was happening in different parts of the country, the provincial government were asked to suppress the propaganda or the promotion or highlighting the information or disseminating the information like regarding civil disobedience movement to the masses. Later on, this act was amplified and it took a form of a Criminal Amendment Act of 1932. Now, during the period of Second War, pre-censorship was reinforced, which means now if we look at the scenario, most of the countries got independence after Second World War, right? And many countries had also gained independence prior to the Second World War. Now, pre censorship was reinforced because the Britishers were using Indian men in the army to fight the Second World War, and there was a lot of propaganda for the freedom of the country, right? So, pre censorship of content was reinforced, which meant any newspaper going in for the publication had to get the content approved from the officials. The Press Emergency Act and the Official Secrets Act were also amended during this time. It is interesting to note that in March 1947, the government appointed a press inquiry committee. Now, this committee was basically constituted to examine the press laws in India, right? Press laws so that the freedom of speech, expression, the freedom of press was there. Later, after independence of India, the Press Objectionable Matter Act enacted in 1951. It was a more comprehensive than the earlier laws affecting the press under British period. Thus, the press in India had faced lot of problems during the British colonial rule. If we sum up the entire thing, we can say that the legislations of press in India were basically to curtail the flow of information from the editor to the masses, from the say reformers to the masses, so that they could not unite together to fight against a common cause. When, after independence, a press inquiry committee was formulated, it was kept in mind that the press law should be such which gave the press the freedom to publish. Freedom of speech and expression was taken up as a freedom of press in India, but the press objectionable matters made sure that we do not publish anything and everything. Say information which was objectionable, information which was found not to be published on the say public forum, they could be taken care of. Thank you.